Hello, everyone. I hope that you are all doing well. I'm excited to touch base about the second week of our learning module about the invisible gifted. I just want to say thank you for taking this discussion board really seriously. To me, this is our most important topic because we really have to address issues of underrepresentation in gifted education. So it's really important that we don't ignore these issues and that we are very responsive to them and also that we advocate for our students. So, this is typically the highlight of the class for me because at this point, we all have an understanding of what giftedness really is, and now we're starting to recognize that we've got a problem. So, before I kind of jump into our discussion board posts and discuss our assignment for next week, I do think it's important to point out that yes, there are problems in gifted education, but that does not mean that we should give up, and it definitely doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do. I do think from a lot of the research in gifted ed, and sometimes even like more colloquial articles that we can read online, there's a pretty negative demeanor in gifted education. We're very focused on we're not doing enough, we're not identifying correctly, and yes, we have problems, but that should never deter you from serving the gifted and from pursuing further studies in gifted education. I've talked to several teachers who just feel really down about this, so I always like to start this discussion by reminding you that your personal opinion as the teacher will trickle out not only to your students but also to the other teachers and the administrators around you. So don't be frustrated that we have issues. More so, just be dedicated to advocating for those students. Even if you feel like that doesn't make a big change, trust me, a lot of teachers who are advocating for correct identification and advocating for correct services really can come together to make a big difference. So when we look at this case study, we have a definite problem on our hands in which Jasmine is working in a Title I school, and her principal told her basically that there were no gifted children in the school environment. So this is, I'm not the individual in this case study, but one of my colleagues does play the role of Jasmine here, and I was very involved in this education program that we had. There was a school that we worked with. It was Title I, and when the program began, I was not in the doctoral program at the time, but when it began, there were no students identified as gifted. So this is a very true story, and I'll kind of tell you how it ended after I go through a couple of your posts. First off, you did a great job talking about the assumptions that we have about what gifted students look like and how they act and how they behave. One of my favorite tools from this entire class is the TABS, or the Traits, Aptitudes, and Behaviors tool. That is such an important tool because it includes illustrations of giftedness in both a positive but also a potentially negative light. So typically we see gifted students as they're super curious and they want to learn. Well, that's true, but they may not be curious and eager to learn about what we want them to learn about. And it's very important that teachers are trained to recognize giftedness even when it doesn't actually look quite nice in the classroom. So a few things that I wanted to point out. I appreciated that several of you took a practical stance here. Yes, this makes us angry. Yes, we first just kind of wanted to throw something. But particularly Chrissy did a good job outlining a 5-year plan. I think that was a really effective way to recognize that this problem cannot be solved in one day. That is an issue that I see oftentimes in gifted ed. We'll just try to do everything at once. What happens then is we have these beautiful definitions of giftedness, like you saw in your gifted education programming studies, but we have the definitions of giftedness that don't necessarily align with the services that are provided. So I did appreciate her proposal for a 5-year plan where we can gradually increase identification and gradually increase the services for gifted students. Katrina did a good job pointing us to the fact that gifted students do not always show up at school as gifted. One of the big differences between students who are coming to school from a lower socioeconomic class than a higher class is the types of experiences that they have been exposed to. So studies have shown that students who come from a lower SES have significantly fewer words in their vocabulary, and also they have not been exposed to as many enriching activities. Now, first off, that's not because their parents don't care. It's so important that we recognize this. Parents are often working 2 or 3 jobs, they're working night shifts, they're doing everything they can to support their students and support the kids that are living at their home. So that often does mean that students spend a lot of time without their parents or without an authority figure, which often means they spend a lot of time on technology, watching television. They're not as exposed to as many vocabulary terms as students whose parents are able to spend more time within because they follow a more traditional work environment. So it is important to realize that some students are coming into school being exposed to more than other students. And really, gifted education is not as much about identifying gifted students as it is about serving all students and providing appropriate learning environments for students who are gifted to be able to demonstrate their gifts. So it's really important that we recognize that they may not be, quote, gifted when they come into the classroom, and that it is our responsibility to promote learning experiences that would allow them to develop and to express their gifts and their talents. Hannah gave a great concept of universal screening. When we talk about gifted education and identification, one thing that is so close and near to my heart is the importance of universal screening. Most gifted education programs include universal screening, but just for 1 year. So for example, in South Carolina, all students are screened at the end of 2nd grade because formal identification begins in 3rd grade in the state of South Carolina, which is great, but that only gives students one chance. From that point on, we really rely on referrals, whether it's a teacher referral. It's possible for students to refer themselves, although most students don't know that, and it is possible for parents to refer as well. But when we depend on teachers to refer students for gifted programming, we have to realize that teachers refer based on their own conceptions of what giftedness means. So, absent of training in gifted education, many teachers hold incorrect assumptions about what giftedness actually is. So they will naturally refer their students who are well behaved and who always have their homework and who are always paying attention. We know that's not always the gifted students. So it's really important that we don't rely on teacher referrals without also providing the appropriate training. A lot of you guys did talk about doing more testing so that the students could be identified. But I do want to emphasize, guys, that gifted students are gifted not because they earn a certain test score. Unfortunately, we really equate giftedness to high test scores because we depend so heavily on gifted, or rather on standardized tests for gifted identification purposes. But giftedness is not about doing super well on these standardized tests. So it's important that we don't only rely on them for identification. So really, just to kind of bring this full circle, I'd like to tell you kind of how this situation ended, or not ended, how it ended when I had to leave the program and actually came here to Winthrop. So the program, or rather the school that we were working with, as I mentioned, had 0 students identified for gifted. I exaggerated the story a little bit for the case study, but the principal was pretty standoff in terms of gifted education. She was very focused on closing the achievement gap, which, guys, is not a bad thing. If you look at No Child Left Behind, actually, we are mandated to close the achievement gap, and a lot of funding is very dependent upon that. So she was very focused on closing the gap, which is natural. Um, and when the university approached her about doing services for gifted students, she was definitely resistant. That was not necessarily, however, because she didn't care, but because she didn't feel like she had appropriate support to give these services. And unfortunately, a lot of university and school relations are not very sustainable. So it's important that when we have programs between universities and local schools, that those programs are not only run by university students. This particular program I was a part of was effective because 2 full-time faculty were committed to keeping the program going. So basically what happened is we spent our entire first year with collaboration with the Title I school simply volunteering and doing whatever the teachers asked us to do. We wanted to become a familiar face in the school so that we could know the students and they could know us. Gradually, throughout the second year, we did push-in classes, which is interesting, meaning that graduate students and faculty would go into, say, a second grade classroom, and we modeled classroom activities that would be effective for gifted learners, but also for all students. So what we did was we tried to provide really engaging and enriching classes that would provide the appropriate opportunity for students who are potentially gifted to be able to express those gifts. We coupled that with a lot of teacher training in the tab. So we talked about how giftedness was not always a pretty thing. And what happened is the university students and the faculty would go in and teach these lessons and allow the teachers the opportunity to sit back and look and observe for indicators of giftedness. So it was a really great model. It worked very well, and we did have an increase in terms of students identified for gifted services, but more importantly, we had an increase in school-wide enrichment and school-wide differentiation for all learners. So something to remember in terms of gifted ed is it is not confined just to the formal gifted education program in the school. Rather, gifted education should be constant because we should always be differentiating for our students. And that goes for all students, not just our gifted learners. So hopefully from the library materials, you are seeing the facts that are just hard to swallow, but they're there. We have a huge issue with underrepresentation in gifted education. I am a huge fan of the TABS form because it helps students recognize these diverse indicators of gifted. So moving into this week. This week's assignment is a little bit different than your other assignments. It allows for some more creative license, which is fun, particularly since we will start studying creativity next week. But your assignment for this week is called the See Me Statement, which basically is a letter from a gifted student asking their teachers and their administrators to see them and to recognize their unique strengths and their unique needs. As a child who would really benefit from gifted services. So your challenge is to first assume the role of a gifted student who may be unrecognized. This could be a student from an underrepresented population. It could be an English as a second language student. It could be a student from a low socioeconomic background. Whatever student you feel really connected to through our studies so far, it could be a twice exceptional student who has a learning disability but is also gifted. Choose one special population that you would be really interested in and try to assume the role of that gifted student. From there, you are writing a letter as that gifted student. So I want you to use first person, use the word I, and talk about yourself as that gifted person. And within this letter, you are addressing 4 main things. So, number 1, make it really clear who you are. So, tell us your name. What grade are you in? What is your home life like? It's not a paper, this is you just giving a background. Tell us the story of who you are. Within that story, number 2, provide evidence that you are gifted. Now, this doesn't mean you're saying, my name is Callie and I scored in the 97th percentile on the MAP test. Now, I want you to think of characteristics. What are some ways that you feel like you're gifted, but people haven't recognized it? I have a journal that I write in every day, and I write my own poetry, and I do outside research. Any ways that you can indicate that you are gifted. And what I would do is look back at the tabs and look at these indicators and see if you can develop a persona for this student that you're writing from. Thirdly, I want you to discuss the challenges that you face as that student. Maybe it's being misunderstood. Maybe it's the fact that you're super interested in dental health, but you're sitting in biology class and they only talk about plants. Talk about what's hard as a gifted student. Maybe it's the fact that your teachers think that you don't work hard enough, but really you're always tired because you take care of your younger brother and sister back home. So again, really become that person. And finally, I want you to list ways that you would like your teachers and your administrators to support you. Again, this isn't general in the sense of, let me into your gifted program. This is, please provide me with extra time in the library to look up sources that I'm really interested in. Or please give me resources that actually represent me appropriately. I'm a gifted Hispanic student who's never learned about any Hispanic individual who has made an impact. That happens, guys, in history. We don't appropriately represent our students. So I want you to really dig deep there and think, how might this gifted student experience their daily life, and what would they really need from their gifted, or rather from their teachers or from their principals. So again, you're writing a letter from the perspective of a gifted student who is likely to be unidentified. Within that letter, you are clearly illustrating who you are, giving us personal history, what your background is, your daily life. Number 2, within that history, you're showing evidence that you are gifted. Thirdly, you're discussing the challenges you face. And finally, you are providing suggestions for the support that you would like from your teachers and or from your administrators. This is typically a really impactful assignment for me to read. It's my favorite one to grade throughout the semester. So I would really challenge you to put yourself in someone else's shoes, or maybe it's your own shoes and you've never had the opportunity to really say these things. As always, I'm here to answer any questions, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful day. Thanks.